something unexpected just unfolded, live on camera, a moment that many analysts are now calling a quiet turning point in North American power dynamics. What looked like a routine diplomatic exchange quickly shifted into something far more consequential. A leader appeared to hesitate, another stepped forward, and within seconds, the balance in that room changed. This is not just about a single meeting. It is about leverage, it is about timing, and it may shape how future negotiations unfold, not just between these two nations, but across global alliances. In the past 24 hours, cameras captured a moment that is now being replayed, analyzed, and debated across political circles. At the center of it, former U.S. President Donald Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. What was expected to be a standard diplomatic appearance turned into a subtle but undeniable shift in tone. The interaction began calmly, controlled, predictable, but then something changed. Trump, known for his assertive negotiation style, appeared to step back just slightly, but noticeably. And Carney, in contrast, did not hesitate. He spoke with clarity, he laid out terms, and he did so in a way that suggested preparation, confidence, and perhaps a deeper strategic plan. Now, moments like this are rarely accidental. Diplomacy is theater, but it is also calculation. Every word, every pause, every shift in posture carries meaning. But this is where the situation becomes more serious, because what we saw was not just a conversation, it was a signal that something behind the scenes may have already shifted before the cameras were even turned on. To understand why this moment matters, we need to step back, because this did not happen in isolation. Over the past several months, tensions between the United States and Canada have been quietly building, not in dramatic headlines, but in policy disagreements, trade discussions, and subtle diplomatic disagreements that rarely make front-page news. At the center of this tension has been economic alignment. Canada, under Carney's leadership, has been repositioning itself less reactive, more independent, moving away from automatic alignment with U.S. policy and toward a more calculated strategic posture. And this is not entirely surprising. Mark Carney is not a traditional politician. His background is in finance, global markets, and central banking. He understands systems. He understands leverage. And perhaps most importantly, he understands timing. Now, here is the detail many people are missing. In recent weeks, there have been quiet but significant policy shifts. Canada has been strengthening trade ties outside of North America. There have been discussions about diversifying economic dependencies. And there have been subtle signals that Ottawa is preparing for a more independent economic path. At the same time, the United States has been navigating its own internal complexities, political divisions, economic pressures, and a leadership environment that is at times unpredictable. And this is where the timelines begin to intersect, because just days before this on-camera moment, there were reports, unconfirmed but widely discussed, about disagreements behind closed doors, disagreements over trade terms, over regulatory alignment, over who sets the conditions moving forward. And then came the meeting. From the outside, it looked routine, cameras, statements, diplomatic language, but beneath that surface, something else was unfolding. Carney's tone was measured but firm. He was not reacting. He was setting the pace. He introduced terms not as proposals, but as expectations, and he did so without raising his voice, without creating confrontation, and Trump, for a brief but critical moment, did not push back. That moment is now being analyzed frame by frame, but this is where the story takes another turn, because in diplomacy, silence can be louder than words. Trump's pause, brief as it was, has raised questions. Was it strategic? Was it calculated restraint? Or was it an acknowledgement of shifting leverage? Analysts are divided. Some believe this was a tactical decision, a choice to avoid escalation in a public setting. Others argue that it reflects a deeper shift, one where the traditional power dynamic between the U.S. and Canada is no longer as one-sided as it once was, and this changes the entire political equation because for decades, the relationship between these two countries has followed a predictable pattern. The United States leads and Canada aligns. Differences exist, but they are managed quietly. What we saw in that moment challenges that pattern, and so Carney did not align. He defined, and that distinction matters. To fully understand the implications, we need to look at the broader global context, because this is not just a bilateral issue. It is part of a larger shift happening across international politics. Middle powers, countries like Canada, are increasingly asserting themselves. They are no longer content to operate within the shadow of larger nations. They are building their own networks, their own strategies, their own leverage. And leaders like Carney represent this new approach, calculated, data-driven, less emotional, more strategic. But this is where things become even more complex because Donald Trump operates on a very different model. His approach to negotiation has always been direct, assertive, often unpredictable. He relies on pressure, on momentum, and on controlling the narrative in real time. So when that approach meets a leader who is methodical, prepared, and resistant to pressure, the outcome becomes less predictable. And that is exactly what we may have witnessed. The interaction was not loud. It was not confrontational, but it was layered. Carney's words were carefully chosen, his timing precise, and his willingness to speak in definitive terms suggests that this was not an improvised moment. It was planned. Now, here is where analysts are focusing their attention. What happened before the cameras turned on? Because moments like this are rarely spontaneous. They are the result of discussions, negotiations, and positioning that happen behind closed doors. There are indications, subtle but significant, that Canada may have entered this meeting with a stronger position than expected. Economic indicators have been stabilizing, trade diversification efforts are beginning to show results, and there is growing confidence within Canadian policy circles. At the same time, the United States is navigating multiple priorities, domestic challenges, international commitments, and a political landscape that demands constant attention. And in negotiations, timing is everything. Carney may have recognized that this was a moment of opportunity, and this is where the story becomes even more strategic. Because setting terms is not just about the present, it is about shaping the future. By defining expectations in a public setting, Carney has created a reference point, a moment that can be revisited, replayed, used as leverage in future discussions. And Trump's response, or lack of immediate resistance, becomes part of that record. This is not about who won the moment. It is about what the moment represents. A shift in tone, a shift in posture, a shift in expectation. But this is where many viewers might underestimate the situation, because power in diplomacy is rarely absolute. It is fluid, it shifts, it adapts, and what we saw may not be a permanent change, but it is a signal that the dynamics are evolving. Now, to understand the deeper motivations, we need to look at the individuals involved. Mark Carney is a strategist. His career has been built on navigating complex systems, financial crises, economic transitions, institutional reforms. He is not driven by short-term optics. He is focused on long-term positioning. His approach to leadership reflects that, measured, analytical, controlled. Donald Trump, on the other hand, is a communicator, a negotiator who understands the power of presence, of narrative, of momentum. His strength lies in shaping perception in real time. So when these two approaches intersect, the outcome is not always immediately clear. And this is where the tension lies, because both leaders are operating with different definitions of success. For Carney, success may be about establishing a new baseline, a new framework for future negotiations. For Trump, success may be about maintaining flexibility, avoiding commitments that limit future options. And in that moment on camera, those two strategies briefly overlapped, but they did not fully align. And that is what makes this situation so significant, because unresolved tension in diplomacy does not disappear. It evolves. It moves behind closed doors into private discussions, into policy decisions that may not be visible to the public, but the effects are real. And this changes how we interpret what comes next, because the next meeting, the next statement, the next policy decision will all be influenced by what happened in that moment. The question now is not just what was said, it is what will follow, and perhaps more importantly, who will define the terms moving forward. But this is where the story is only beginning to unfold. So as the immediate moment begins to settle, the deeper implications start to surface, and they are far more complex than a single exchange between two leaders. What appeared to be a controlled diplomatic interaction is now being examined through a broader strategic lens. Because in international politics, moments like these often signal shifts that extend far beyond the room in which they occur. The first layer of analysis centers on political leverage. When a leader publicly establishes terms without immediate resistance, it subtly alters expectations, not just between those two individuals, but across the wider diplomatic network observing the exchange. Other governments take note, negotiators adjust their assumptions, and internal policy teams begin recalibrating their strategies. But the real risk may still lie ahead, because public positioning can create private pressure. Once a statement is made on camera, it becomes more difficult to reverse without appearing inconsistent. That creates a narrowing of options. And in high-stakes negotiations, reduced flexibility can quickly become a liability. From a legal perspective, even informal public commitments can carry weight. While nothing in that exchange may be legally binding, it can influence how future agreements are interpreted. Language matters, tone matters, and the sequence in which expectations are presented can shape the framework of formal negotiations that follow. This is particularly relevant in trade discussions. If one side is seen to have accepted a baseline, even implicitly, it can shift the starting point of future talks. That alone can have measurable economic consequences. And this is where the global stakes become clearer, because the economic relationship between the United States and Canada is not isolated. It is deeply integrated into global supply chains, energy markets, manufacturing networks, financial systems. Even small adjustments in policy direction can ripple outward, affecting partners across Europe, Asia, and beyond. If Canada is indeed moving toward a more independent economic posture, as some analysts suggest, it could trigger a broader realignment. Other mid-sized economies may see this as a precedent, a signal that it is possible to assert greater autonomy without immediate consequences. But that assumption carries its own risks, because the United States remains a dominant force, not just economically, but politically and militarily. Any perceived shift in alignment can prompt responses that are not immediately visible, but strategically significant. And this is where the analysis begins to move beyond economics into the realm of geopolitical signaling. Diplomatic interactions are rarely just about the content of the discussion. They are also about the message being sent to third parties, allies, competitors, observers. When a country like Canada appears to assert its position more forcefully, it sends a signal not just to Washington, but to other global actors. It suggests confidence, stability, and a willingness to operate independently, and that can attract attention. Now, analysts are quietly warning about another possibility, that this moment may be part of a larger strategic repositioning, one that extends beyond North America. In recent months, there have been subtle indications of Canada increasing its engagement with European and Indo-Pacific partners, trade dialogues, policy coordination, strategic discussions that, while not widely publicized, suggest a broader diversification effort. If that trajectory continues, it could reshape how Canada is perceived, not just as a regional partner, but as a more active global player. And that introduces a new layer of complexity. Because global institutions are built on balance, on predictability, on established roles, a shift in one country's posture can create uncertainty within those systems. Organizations like the World Trade Organization, the G7, and various multilateral forums rely on alignment among key members. If that alignment begins to loosen, even slightly, it can affect decision-making processes, policy outcomes, and long-term planning. But there's one final factor that could change everything, and it lies beneath the surface of what we have seen so far. An investigative detail that has not received widespread attention, but is now beginning to emerge in policy discussions. It concerns timing, the timing of this exchange, the timing of recent policy signals, and the timing of economic adjustments that have been quietly taking place. And when these elements are viewed together, a pattern begins to form. Canada's recent moves, diversifying trade relationships, strengthening internal economic indicators, and now publicly asserting its position, appear to be part of a coordinated sequence. Not reactive, but premeditated. And that raises a critical question. Was this moment on camera the result of preparation rather than circumstance? If so, it suggests a level of strategic planning that extends beyond a single interaction. It implies that the groundwork for this shift may have been laid over an extended period through policy adjustments, diplomatic outreach, and internal alignment. And that changes how the entire situation is understood, because it transforms the narrative from a spontaneous moment into a calculated signal, a signal that may have been intended not just for the United States, but for a much wider audience. And this is where the future begins to come into focus, not as a single outcome, but as a set of possible trajectories. The first scenario is one of stabilization. In this case, the moment we witness becomes a point of recalibration. Both sides recognize the shift, adjust their expectations, and move forward with a more balanced negotiation framework. The relationship remains strong, but evolves more equal, more structured with clearer boundaries. This would likely be the preferred outcome for global markets and institutions. Stability, even with adjusted dynamics, is generally easier to manage than uncertainty. But the second scenario introduces tension. In this version, the public assertion of terms leads to a more competitive negotiation environment. Each side becomes more cautious, more protective of its position. Discussions become slower, more complex, and the risk of disagreement increases. This does not necessarily lead to conflict, but it does create friction. And friction over time can affect everything from trade flows to policy coordination. Now, analysts are quietly considering a third scenario, one that is less visible, but potentially more significant, a gradual strategic divergence. In this case, Canada continues to expand its independent posture, strengthening relationships outside of its traditional framework, reducing reliance, building new alliances. The United States, in response, adjusts its own strategy, potentially focusing more on other partnerships or recalibrating its expectations within the North American context. This scenario would not unfold quickly. It would be gradual, subtle, But over time, it could lead to a redefinition of one of the most established bilateral relationships in modern politics, and that is where the long-term implications become most profound. Because relationships at this level are not just about policy, they are about trust, about predictability, about shared assumptions. When those elements begin to shift even slightly, the effects can extend across decades, that the real risk may still lie ahead, because in all three scenarios, one factor remains constant: uncertainty. And uncertainty in international relations has a way of creating unintended consequences. Markets react, allies adjust, competitors observe, and at times take advantage of perceived openings. That is why moments like this, quiet, controlled, but symbolically powerful, are taken seriously within policy circles. They are not just analyzed for what they are examined for what they might become. And this is where the story ultimately leads to a broader question about the nature of power in a changing world. Is influence still defined by size and dominance, or is it increasingly shaped by strategy, timing, and the ability to act with precision? What we witness suggests that the answer may be evolving, that even established dynamics are not fixed, that new patterns can emerge, sometimes gradually, sometimes in a single moment captured on camera, and this is where the global stakes become clearer. And because if this is indeed part of a larger shift, it will not remain confined to one relationship. It will influence how other countries approach negotiations, how alliances are formed, how expectations are set. It may even redefine what it means to lead in a multipolar world. But there is one final factor that could change everything. So the response, not the immediate reaction, but the calculated, measured response that comes next. Because in diplomacy, the second move often matters more than the first. It reveals intent, it defines direction, and it sets the tone for everything that follows. So as analysts continue to examine that moment frame by frame, word by word, the focus is already beginning to shift from what happened to what happens next. Because in the end, this is not just a story about a single exchange. It is a story about transition, about recalibration, about the subtle, often unseen forces that shape the course of international relations. And perhaps most importantly, it is a reminder that even in a world of established power structures, change can begin quietly, not with confrontation, but with a shift in posture, a change in tone, a moment where one side speaks and the other pauses. And that pause may be the most significant detail of all. The question now is simple, but deeply consequential. Was this a temporary moment of adjustment or the beginning of a lasting shift in how power is negotiated on the global stage?